The Aussie male is a creature of capable of harshness and tenderness, and sometimes confronted by that duality and forced to choose one or the other, when in fact perhaps they could simply realize that the two coexist, and that in the two is the whole, and in that whole is a simple living thing.
Look, would it spoil your day if you told me why I was here?
In the vernacular, your country needs you.
His name is synonymous with the Australian film industry. Classics like Sunday Too Far Away,
Burning Boer farmhouses.
Breaker Morant, The Man from Snowy River. Jack Thompson came to typify the Aussie bloke. Rugged, likeable, laconic, out there.
Well.
But the real Jack Thompson is a more complex man.
This is great. Greg, this is my dad. Very pleased to meet you. You can call me Harry.
Closer, he says, to this character than any other. Harry in the film The Sum of Us. A knockabout dad whose adult son is gay.
Oh. Up your bum.
It's just a joke. Dad's always making jokes.
Oh. Yeah, like that time with the 11 to 4 polish.
Steady on, Dad. It's a bit off, that is.
Is it?
In company.
Well, what was that about, 11 to 4?
Yeah,
Don't worry about it. It's just, you wouldn't be interested. It's just a misunderstanding.
To Jack Thompson, Harry's tolerance is an unsung strength in the Australian man.
I work at the Botanic Gardens.
Is that right? Perhaps the young fellow would like another drink.
That's a very old-fashioned sort of Australian tolerance that must have come out of the bush, out of the frontier, out of World War I, out of men being forced together to live together whether they like it or not. The sense that there was an old friend of mine who lived on the farm next door who would never come into the house. He'd sit on the veranda and have a cup of tea, but he wouldn't come into the house. I said to him one day, "Why won't you come into the house, Billy?" And he said, "Yeah, don't take offence, but, you know, you just don't go into a bloke's house. I mean, you know, it's nothing really. I mean, but, you know, you never know what a bloke might be, a Calafumpian or something. They mightn't want you in there." This sense that you don't invade that part of a person's life is there in Harry's tolerance. He says, you know, he could have been all sorts of things that would anger me much more than him being homosexual. It's a bit of a worry, particularly with the disease thing, but it's not the sort of thing that, you know, it could be a lot worse than that.
It seems to me that you've taken us as a nation almost on an exploration of Australian masculinity in the roles that you've played. Do you see that? Do you relate to that idea?
I relate to that. Yeah, I relate to that. I think that that's been my good fortune. I think it's also been, as my brother Peter observed, a part of what's happened in my life, having been educated in sort of a literate, in fact literary, middle-class Sydney home, and then going to work at 15 in the bush, finding it easy to live among the people who worked in the bush. And I've felt always that it was possible for me to, in playing them honestly, to let people see that there is this common ground, that it is every man.
Interestingly, though, your background is not every man. It's
not.
Pretty unconventional sort of background. I'd like to go through that with you now. Your mother died when you were very young.
4, during my, yes, just before I was 5.
And your father was away at the war.
Right. And my brother David and I, David's a year younger than I am, were placed in a school at Narrabeen a sort of boarding school called Lake House, or the Children's Seaside Hotel. The school was run on the same lines as Summerhill, which...
So very progressive.
Very progressive, incredibly progressive. It would still be considered progressive.
Now, by the time you were at the school, though, your father had returned from the war.
Well, he returned from the war after the first year we were at the school. He had returned from the war. And I suppose while he sorted himself out, he left David and I there. He visited a couple of times. He then, some of this is a bit vague to me, but he then remarried. At about that time, he remarried.
How old were you when he remarried?
6 or 7, I think, 6. And he, his second wife, Heather, he had a child by his second wife, Heather, and their first child was both physically and mentally ill, in constant pain. It must have been an awful thing for her and for him too. And I don't know when. I didn't find out until much later in my life. They moved away. They moved to Western Australia. They had more children, and she asked Harold not to tell those children of these 2 children by a previous marriage. So David and I went on with our lives. Now, I became, at the school, became childhood friend with Peter Thompson. David was still my brother. Peter was this boy I constantly played with. He and I played the same games. I went to his place on weekends. We became inseparable. And ultimately, John Thompson adopted me, but that was not until officially at the age of 10. I lived with the Thompsons from the age of 8 and then was officially adopted at the age of 10. And it could not have been better. I was adopted by the family of my best friend. My best friend became a brother.
But your birth brother was left behind at the school.
Was left behind at the school, indeed. He and I stayed in touch with each other, but I know in later years that David felt bitter about the separation. I think bitter about not just the separation, but bitter about the fact that I had a family and that he didn't.
How did you feel about the fact that you didn't see your father, that effectively your father severed contact with you and your brother?
In retrospect, I must have felt abandoned. I can remember in recollection that there were times very early in the piece when I can remember children going away on holidays and desperately wanting to have somewhere to go, desperately wanting to be able to go to where are my parents, where's my family, and making up stories. Oh, they'll come, you know, my father will come and pick me up and that sort of thing. But it wasn't long before I went away on weekends to the Thompsons' house. Pat Thompson used to say I adopted them and they didn't adopt me. There was a weekend and there was a knock on the door, and Pat came to the door and looked out and looked around and there was no one there. And she was about to close the door again and she looked down and he was the little Jack Payne as I was then, looking up, and all I could think to say was that one of the most lame lies of my life. I lost my way to the butcher's. which she said so touched her that was impossible. She took me inside, called the school and said, don't worry about him, he's here, I'll bring him back on Monday, you know. For me at the time, it was, I was following an unbelievable run of good fortune, it seemed to me, and embracing the life that was offered to me.
Now, this is interesting, I think, because you do see it as good fortune, don't you? I mean, a lot of people could look at your life and say, here's a man who was abandoned by his father, whose ostensibly stepmother, as she would have been, said she didn't want him or his brother, who's put into a boarding school, and then adopted out by a family, could be a recipe for tragedy. But in a sense, both the boarding school and the family you see as real bonuses in your life.
Well, they were. As you said, there are circumstances, and you can have two people given the same circumstances respond in a very different way. To one, it will be tragedy. To the other, it will be an opportunity. And for me, there was no doubt that, I mean, while I was at Lake House, it was just life. In retrospect, Lake House was an extraordinarily liberal education, a wonderful introduction to literature, art, and music. From very young, we had our own little percussion orchestra there. We were encouraged to paint. We were encouraged to make puppets and do our own plays. The life of the imagination was paramount. I was then adopted into a family with a mother who was a brilliant cook, who was a loving and kind woman, an author, who, together with her husband, ran a sort of a salon where they had wonderful meals, invited people to dinner, and all sorts of things were discussed, not simply the arts, but all sorts of aspects of life. John Thompson, a major figure in poetry in his time, surrounded by all of that, a man who believed that life was for living, a man who was a bon vivant, a man who encouraged me when I found it difficult to deal with high school and said, what I really want to do is to go out there and work on a cattle station. He made it possible. To have that sort of thing given to you is a dream. It's like being one of those funny dolls that you can't knock over. It's always kind of landing on your feet, you know. Here I am again. Gee, look, Harry, they've done it again.
So do you see yourself as a resilient person then? Do you think there's an intrinsic resilience in you as a character that meant that you got through abandonment and rejection?
I think there is, but I think that resilience, I think that resilience is something that is there, but at the heart of it, there is something sensitive that resilience is there to protect. I'm deeply affected by things. I'm moved easily. I'm a man of passion. And if you're going to live humanely and lovingly, if you're going to live with your arms and your heart open, then you need to be resilient.
But of course, a lot of people who've been abandoned or who feel they were abandoned, particularly as children, do put those walls up in front of them, don't they? Why do you think you haven't done that, or have you?
I haven't, because I think that there are just sort of two ways of dealing with it. One is to close it off and say, I'm never going to let that happen to me ever again. And the other is to say, you know what? That's going to happen a lot. You better learn to live life like that and understand that that is a part of life.
Did you see your father again after you'd been adopted?
Yes. There was about something like 35 years in which I didn't see him. And there was one occasion when apparently every member of the family that they could get together turned up. But my father, Harry, you see, didn't turn up. At the last minute, it was just, he couldn't bear. I think he felt much more guilt about the two boys who are now men than the two boys who are now men did. They felt it's past. Then later, my father had moved to Western Australia, and the reunion occurred there with our father, with Harold.
And what was that meeting like?
The meeting was wonderful. The meeting was wonderful. It was easy. It was curiously easy. I can remember Lee, my partner, standing at the other end of the room with his third wife, Billy, standing at the other end of the room. And at this stage, Harry and I were up at the other end, and we were both leaning against the mantelpiece talking to each other. And she said, look at them. Look at them. They haven't seen each other in 40-some years. They stand the same, they look the same, they talk the same, and it's as if they had never been apart. And it was like that.
Why do you think it was easy for you? Do you think it was because by then you had your own children, your own sense of family?
I think so, and I think because I had been, there's this sense of good fortune. I had been very well looked after by life. There was nothing for me to reproach this man with. And he was a good man. He was a nice man. And in that same 12 months that I met him, that he met my son Patrick, my new son Billy, and David and I, in that same year he died. So that within this 1 year, the rapprochement, the reunion, and the loss again had occurred.
How did you feel about that loss when it happened?
I was devastated. Because I was mature, because I had a child, because he was this man. I had a grandfather rather, I had a grandchild for him. I had a grandfather for my son. There was a time for a few years of saying hello to each other. Time for a few years of that relationship being there. And then it was gone. And it was devastating. It left me empty. I remember we were making the film Wind, and we were in Hawaii, and I learned of his death. And we were going out that day filming on one of those beautiful 12-meter yachts, and the two crews going out, and the skipper learnt of my father's death. And just before we filmed, he called out from the other boat and he said, "This is a custom that we have. I just want to say that Jack has learnt of his father's death, and as a mark of respect." And he'd given me a glass of whiskey, and he had one himself on the other boat. And all the sailors were wearing lei, and they took them off and they threw them on the water. And the leis floated on the water, and he and I said to Harry, poured the whiskey into the water.
Very important moment.
Yeah, I lost my father.
So how have you approached fatherhood? What's been important to you about being a father?
Oh, I've just had probably the best Christmas of my life with an 8-year-old son. I realized how voyeuristic it is as a parent, how you view your child's life, how you see their life, not living through them, but having the child remind you that you came here by that path, that you too were a child, and that it's in that way that we stumble, gamble, wonder our way from moment to moment to our here and now.
And your oldest son is how old?
My oldest son is 29. My grandson has just turned 4. And my youngest son is 9 in May.
And has it been different the second time around, being a father?
Yes. The first time, Patrick's mother and I separated very early in the relationship, but even, I'm sure, had Beverly and I stayed together, it was that time in my life when having a child was another one of the things that was happening in my life while we were all on our way somewhere. Now, I don't know where we're on our way to, and I don't think that we've all arrived there, but it didn't seem this time as if I was on my way somewhere.
Did it seem like you'd arrived somewhere?
Not really, but it seemed like I had more time to be a part of this little boy's life.
I have to be honest with you and say that when I mentioned to a few people I was going to be talking to you today, without exception, they all said, oh, are you going to ask him about living with the two sisters? It seems as though this is something
The compulsory.
that is inextricably linked with your persona. A lot of time has elapsed now since that relationship.
Yeah.
It was, what, how many years ago that it finished?
16 years ago.
And it actually lasted for about 15 years.
15 years, yeah. Yeah.
Now that there has been that amount of time.
Off and on, I would have to say, over 15 years.
Off and on?
Yeah, but it was, yes, it was there.
Now that that amount of time has elapsed, I mean, do you have any perspectives on that period of your life now? Do you understand what it was all about? Can you explain it?
I can't explain it. What I find extraordinary is that it is seen as extraordinary, because it was not extraordinary to us. And when I look around me, it's a very ordinary relationship. The public admission of the relationship was what was not ordinary, but then not very many people have their relationships thrown into such public light. I think that a lot of people do have a husband and a lover, a wife and a lover, and ménage à trois is extremely common if you examine literature.
And people wanted to know how it actually worked.
I know.
Did it work? Did it work?
Well, it went on for 15 years, but then, you know, marriages go on for 15 years and later people say bitterly it never worked. There are times when it worked and there are times when it didn't. It seemed, from within, it seemed at times a painfully ordinary relationship.
Well, your relationship, of course, with one of the women has continued, hasn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, the love and affection remains. It was just impossible with that one and with that one and with the pressures and whatever. It could have been that the whole thing fell apart, but it didn't. And the relationship remained between myself and Leona and has remained ever since. So Leona and I have been together now 29 years, which is relatively long-standing relationship. Yeah.
Mm.
It fascinates people. It has fascinated people. I think what's interesting is somebody said to me the other day, "And are you still with the two wives, Jack?" So, you know, how's it going? You know.
Well, to be honest, I think a lot of men are just a tad envious.
The men who are envious should think about their life with one wife and then multiply that by two.
Duality is a bit of a Thompson tray. Beside the rugged Aussie bloke, there's always been a bohemian, a man comfortable with seeming contradictions.
I think that life is that dichotomy. I mean, I've practiced Tai Chi for, well, since 1976 on a relatively daily basis, at least 4 to 5 times a week. The understanding that life is a duality, that we are not one thing but both things, that we are this mixture of things, that in the heart of the person filled with a sort of a negative prejudice, there is a tenderness that they can't bear admit, and that somehow that informs that hardness. It's not always as simple as that, but the two things can exist side by side and do. There is the title of John Thompson's last anthology of verse is I Hate and I Love. It comes from the short couplet by the Roman poet Catullus, whom he admired. And in translation, the poem is I hate and I love. I do not know why I do these things. All I know is I hate and I love.
And there is a lot of duality in your life, isn't there? Or there has been a lot of duality. You've had two fathers.
I've had two fathers.
Two lovers simultaneously?
Indeed, a living duality. I would be happy to say I was a living duality. I would feel that is the truth of it, that I am the full and the empty. That, boy, I will be claiming to be the Tao itself next.
If you were writing a role for yourself, for Jack Thompson, what would the character be like?
It would be very hard for me to write about that person. I don't know that person. Not really.
Not really?
Not really.
Are you closer to knowing that person now?
I hope so. I hope
You're approaching 60.
I hope
I wonder
so.
what it's like to
think
be approaching 60.
It's wonderful. It's, I can remember somebody when I was in my 40s, someone in their 50s saying, all I can tell you, Jack, is it gets easier. It actually gets better. And in my experience, it does get easier and better. I don't mean that it gets easier to run 100 yards, but the management of your own life experience day by day, I think, gets easier. Perhaps I do know more about myself.